Hello and welcome to our CSS Grid course. CSS, of course, stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's how we make web documents look so darn good. CSS Grid is a new specification as part of the CSS standard, and hopefully you've had some experience in working with CSS. So we'll just jump right in. Of course, CSS is Cascading Style Sheets for web documents. Now, web documents are structured such that they actually have three parts. First is the HTML portion, which should contain the content of the document. So the HTML part of of a web page should contain the text, the meaningful graphics, pictures, photos, graphs, whatever, video. The JavaScript is a computer programming language that works with HTML to provide interactive portions of web pages. So they might do things like get user input, make decisions based on those on the input that the users put in, get information from different sources, and so on. And finally, what we're concerned about in this part of our course is CSS, which is the styling of the document. So the styling is going to include things like, the colors, the fonts, the way that the elements are arranged on the page, and things like that. So CSS is the styling of the web document, and we want to separate the content from the styling so that we can restyle the content any way we want to without having to change or alter the content. Now, CSS Grid is a brand new standard. It was developed by the Mozilla people, the people who bring you Firefox, and our subject matter expert for this course is Jen Simmons, who works with Mozilla. She's a design consultant with them, and she's quite the evangelist for CSS Grid. And she says, and I think she's quite right, that Grid revolutionizes web design and brings real page layout like you might get in a program like InDesign for paper layout to the web. Just a brief history of web layout so you can know why this is revolutionary and what a difference it makes. We're going to go all the way back to the beginning of web design. The first model, if you will, of web pages was basically that of a word processor document. Basically, text and elements just flowed straight down the page. This is a very early, this is from the early 1990s, maybe the late 1980s. Mosaic was one of the first web browsers, and here is a typical page from that era. You got the logo at the top. There's not enough room for text next to it. Text does not flow around objects in the original HTML, and it just flows right down the page, much like you would see in a Word document. I just wanted to show you this one. I'm sorry this picture's a little fuzzy. It was a little small, but this is Pizza Hut, apparently an early adopter of the web. This is a long time ago. This is Windows 3.1, it looks like. So here's Welcome to Pizza Hut. There's logo at the top, and as you can see, the text just flows down the page, and there's some user input boxes there for your name and address and that sort of thing, so they know where to deliver the pizza. But it's just a box. It's just flowing straight down the page. Some people tried to game the system, and in kind of a sneaky way, designers started to use something that was built into the HTML standard. And if you've worked with word processor documents, Google Docs, Microsoft Word, or whatever, you know that you can embed tables into into your document. And this is true of HTML documents as well. And as you can see, a table has cells, and it has a kind of a bar across the top for titles and such, and labels down the side. And what some people realized is that in HTML you can actually put text, you can put pictures, you can put anything you want in those cells, and so that people started laying out web pages, making them a table. Well, tables are meant to really show the content, not be a design element. So this is not a legitimate use of tables to lay out your web page. Here's a web page that was built using tables. This is actually maybe kind of a legitimate use of tables because this is actually showing you information. But we could have put, where it says movie titles, we could have put a copy of the DVD box or some other graphic there. So people were laying out entire web pages or parts of web pages pretending that they were tables. But this is not a legitimate use. A table is to present data normally. It is not to structure the design of your web page. Next, the CSS standards started to be developed, and there were some positioning elements within CSS. One of the elements was what was called floats, which allowed you to move elements to either the right or left of the screen, and you could clear out the space to make that happen and such. But this does not allow exact placement on the screen, but it does pretty much bring us to what we consider more or less modern web design. You look at these websites here. These are done with earlier versions of CSS. You can set some headers and some footers, and you can set stuff on the right side and the left side of the page, and you can start to wrap text around graphics. And this is pretty much what the web has looked like for the last, I don't know, probably 10 years or so, maybe a little bit longer. And this worked out pretty well, and this made some really nice web pages, although they did kind of start to look alike because you could only move stuff to the left and the right, and then we're flowing our content down the screen, which worked really well when most of the screens were formatted as kind of as a landscape. You think about your laptop or your desktop environment. You have a landscape screen. It's pretty big. Web pages look great like that. But then this comes along. It's hard to remember sometimes that smartphones have only been with us for about 10 years now. The Apple iPhone was introduced 10 years ago, and it exploded the size and orientation of screens. So now we don't have as many landscape screens as laptops and desktops tend to have. Now we've got portrait screens, and they're running they're running the opposite direction, and they're all different sizes, ranging from a couple of hundred pixels to a couple of thousand pixels. So web designers started to think about what they call responsive design, so that one design would work on several size screens. One way to do this built into the CSS standard is you're able to say, hey, what screen size am I working with? And then have a specific piece of code that works with that specific size screen, which is really nice when you've got all different sizes screens, but obviously it increases the complexity of your code because you have to style specifically for each kind of screen. So developers came up with frameworks to manage these responsive systems, and they did call them grid systems. But as you look at this here, you might notice that the grid is kind of a one-way grid. It's a column-based layout, and because that's what basically what HTML gives us is a flow down the page. So these column systems were breaking up the page into columns where we could flow stuff down the columns, and then we could just rearrange the columns depending on the screen size. We could stack them on top of each other, or have the most important column take up most of the space, and that sort of thing. But it's still a column-based layout, and we're not quite there yet, because if you think about it, a screen has it's got two dimensions. It's got a horizontal dimension and a vertical dimension. And so that's where we're at now, is we're moving into that that second dimension, if you will. Again, this is from Jen Simmons again, and she thinks, and I agree with her, that CSS Grid is moving us into an amazing future where we can really control all of the elements of a layout. So we're going to be able to lay out our web pages so the elements go where we want them to go, and we can lay out web pages in the same way that a newspaper editor or a magazine editor would lay out their pages. So here we are with CSS Grid, and that's what we're going to be learning about in the next few things. This is Jen Simmons again. This is a demonstration she came up with. This is a responsive grid design, and you'll notice the elements moving around. In this case, all the elements are colored rectangles, but they could be text, they could be photos, they could be all kinds of things. And how we want them to respond is now our choice. Before, the web browser decided how the elements are going to respond. Now it's our choice in the grid system. So what's all this going to look like when we start to code? Well, what we're going to have, again, what we've done is we've taken that vertical system of the frameworks and we've added, ta-da, horizontal lines. So we're going to have horizontal and vertical lines, which are our grid tracks. Where those grid tracks intersect, we're going to have grid cells. And then we can take grid cells and combine them together into a grid area. And we can define these areas on the page either by the grid line that defines them, or we can define the area and then name the area. So we could on the lower right here we have grid area. We could name that spot number 1 and tell the browser to put graphic A in spot number 1. So this is going to simplify our coding quite a bit. Grid items can be all kinds of combinations of horizontal and vertical cells. So we can make things different sizes and different proportions. This is what the code's going to look like. This is very familiar to you if you've looked at CSS code before. We start with hooray, display grid. And basically what this is doing is telling the browser that we're going to be displaying a grid here and that we're going to lay things out in this grid. And then we tell it what the structure of the grid is going to be. So in this case we've laid out a grid that has 3 columns. It says repeat 3 times, and each one is going to be 1 FR. FR, well, that's a fractional unit. So what we've got here is, since we've got 3 columns across the browser window, each column is going to take up 1/3 of the browser window. So if we've got a 1200 pixel wide laptop, each column is going to be 400 pixels. If we have a 300 pixel wide phone, each column is going to take up 100 pixels. So this is going to simplify our responsiveness by quite a bit. We can just tell it what proportion of the screen we want things to take up. And in the same way, we've got rows. Yay, rows. And in this case, we've got 4 of them. Each one is going to be 1/4 of the screen. So we've defined an item, and we tell it what grid column to start in and what grid column it's going to end in and what row it's going to start in and what row it's going to end in. And in this case, this is going to be a responsive design. This shape is going to take up 2/3 of the screen horizontally and half of the screen vertically. It's always going to be the same proportion on the screen. We have a number of ways that we can specify how to use the grid space. We can have a fixed portion. If we don't want it to, if we don't want an element to be responsive, we want it always the same size, no matter screen size. Obviously, this is kind of a dangerous one, but it is part of the standard, so we can have it fixed. We can have those fractional units, and we can have different proportions within one row. So we can set a bigger part of the row to one element, and then finally we can allow the content of the cell to set the size of the cell. So we can squeeze the content into the cell, or we can have the cell expand and contract around the content size. This gives us tremendous amount of flexibility when we're laying out our HTML elements. So horizontally, we can just right justify, left justify. We can center. Hooray for centering! You don't have to do any math. Just tell it to center. We can stretch the content over the entire portion, and the same thing happens vertically. We can align items at the top. We can align items at the bottom. Oh, we can horizontal. We can vertically center, which is great. Again, we used to have to do all kinds of math to get things to come out in the center of a portion of a web page, or we can stretch the content over the entire grid area. So we've got lots to learn. There's a lot to learn about the grid standards, all the different ways of specifying how the elements fit and everything. And this is the brave new world of web development. And I hope you're ready to start on this journey in looking at CSS Grid, and so that you can lay out web pages that are exactly the way you want them.